Sam, what do you know about Serbia?
Slavic country in East Europe, used to be sort of the hub of Yugoslavia. I know in the current form they're trying to get into the EU, but they also have very close ties with Russia. Very complicated region that it's kind of at the heart of over there.
I didn't have anything funny to say. That's accurate and appropriate for leading into our conversation.
Serbian people generally don't have a lot of funny things to say either.
Hello and welcome to Revolutions of Our Time, the podcast where we look at protests, revolutions, and try and tease out some lessons for how we can fight the good fight. My name's Adam, and with me, as always, is Sam, a man who is feeling the full effects of the climate changing with a now sweltering August in California. How are you doing today, Sam?
I'm good. I don't think the sweltering August is as surprising as the sweltering October that will be here, and the cold June we had.
Yeah, that's it's not great. That's not ideal.
We're used to that. You're now in the UK. Congratulations, by the way. And
Thanks.
And I've heard it's quite dry over there. A lot of the rolling green hills are a bit yellow this summer, and climate change seems to be hitting that spot a bit harder than it is here.
Yeah, it's not that warm, but it is very dry, and the hills are yellow and hay-like. We'll see how that progresses throughout the rest of the year. But while this isn't exactly an episode about the climate will come into it in ways that I didn't necessarily expect looking into it. I've just done a little series on environmental protests, while Sam, you've been looking at Christianity and the role of Christianity in protests. And I've sort of finished the run of environmental protests, didn't have any more planned. Maybe we'll revisit them again in the future. And so I wanted to visit a current protest movement that is in full swing and has been in the news recently. It is August 24th as we're recording, and you may have seen in the news in the past week, 10 days, that there has been violence erupting in Serbia. But before then, as always, we do have an Independence Day to celebrate. I've lost track of when these episodes are coming out, so I wanted to just give a big congratulations to an Independence Day that's coming up. Thematically appropriate, it felt, because on the 8th of September is the Independence Day of North Macedonia, who gained independence from Yugoslavia on the 8th of September 1991, following the 1991 Macedonian independence referendum. This was approved by 96% of the population in Macedonia, now North Macedonia, with a turnout of 76%, though most ethnic Albanians in Macedonia boycotted the referendum because of how the second half was worded. The wording of the referendum question was, are you for a sovereign and independent state of Macedonia with a right to enter into any future alliances with the sovereign states of Yugoslavia?
Yeah, explain the problematic wording.
I am not entirely sure and would love for any ethnic Albanians to write in. However, I believe it's because Albania was never a part of Yugoslavia, and I think that was part of the tensions within Yugoslavia was between ethnic Albanians and ethnic Slavs. And so in North Macedonia, maintaining that link to what was then still Yugoslavia was a problem for the Macedonians of Albanian descent.
Okay. And I was following the beef between now North Macedonia and Greece for a long time. Just for people that are unaware, Macedonia has a very ancient rooted meaning to that name, in that specifically like Alexander the Great and his father, like their kingdom was called Macedonia or Macedonia. And that area that they lived and ruled from is completely in modern Greece. And the North Macedonians now, this Slavic country, completely claim Alexander the Great. They built a giant statue of him in Skopje. That's the capital, right? And and there was just this beef between Greece and Macedonia at the time. That was just its name, because Greece has a province called Macedonia in it as well, which is the more historical one. So then after decades of this feud, they finally came to the agreement that now the country of Macedonia would be called North Macedonia, though they still claim Alexander the Great sort of as their cultural founding father, though there's no historical basis for it, really.
Yeah, well, I think probably some North Macedonians would disagree with you, but...
Well, let's look at the language that Alexander the Great spoke. He was not Slavic.
He was a Greek. It is amazing the power of narrative, because this is... I mean, it's ultimately, who cares? He's been dead for thousands of years, but the reason this happened was because it would affect North Macedonia's potential EU ascension, because Greece would not have approved EU ascension in North Macedonia if they had just kept the name Macedonia. I think they're still quite a ways from EU ascension anyway.
Yeah.
But it is something they desire. In fact, when I was in that part of the world in 2019, going through the Balkans, I wanted to travel from Belgrade to Thessaloniki in Greece, and there was a night train that went through Skopje, but they stopped that night train for a number of years because of this beef between North Macedonia and Greece, because of the name. And that's basically the only reason. Which, of the reasons that countries could be beefing, is one of the better and funnier ones.
There was no blood spilt, so I think the combination of all of that makes it very funny.
But we digress. This episode, we're going to be talking about Serbia and the mass protests that have been happening there for the past 9 months or so. We talked about these briefly in our sort of half-year check-in episode, which went out, I believe, in early August, so a little bit late on the half-year. But over the past 10 days or so, they've appeared more in the news because of increased violence, and so I thought it was worth taking a bit of a deeper dive into them. Sam, what, if anything, do you remember about these protests?
So I'll preface this with saying as well that a good chunk of our audience so far is in America, and I'm guessing they've not seen any of this in the news, because I haven't even seen an escalation to the news, because I stopped digging for it, and at the moment in America, the only news that is anywhere is basically anything Trump does, currently occupying the Capitol with the military, or like Gavin Newsom tweeting AI memes at him. Those are the only things that really make the news these days. But what I know about the Serbian protests is that they were sparked last year in November or December, I believe. And it was due to a collapse of a canopy at a train station in Novi Sad, like the town of Novi Sad. And like 10 people-ish died, like around 10 people died. And that this collapse sparked protests because it was a symptom of a wider corruption in the government and lack of management of their infrastructure and resources. And people are fearing that, you know, other catastrophes could happen if those things aren't addressed in the government. That's what I know about it. I don't know about the increasing tensions.
Yeah, that's pretty much spot on. So on the 1st of November 2024, the canopy of a railway station in Novi Sad collapsed. Initially, 14 people died. Another person died 2 weeks later from their injuries, and another person died from complications resulting from their injuries on the 21st of March 2025. So ultimately, this killed 16 people. Novi Sad, if you're not familiar, is the second largest city in Serbia, with a population of 260,000 in the city proper and about 325,000 in the metro area.
I was not aware that it was the second largest city in Serbia.
It is the second largest, and it is the largest city on the Danube that is not a capital city.
Okay.
Which is just a fun little factoid there. The protests properly started up on the 22nd of November. Before that, there had been some silent vigils that had been operated by some university students. And at one of these silent vigils, these 15-minute silent vigils, they were basically beaten up by some thugs who were affiliated with the ruling SNS party, the Progressive Party, and an off-duty police officer there. There were some demands that followed. There were 4 demands. In fact, I believe there were 3 demands, and then a 4th one was added later on, and you can tell which is the 4th by the sort of lack of additional context that was added to it. But basically, the students demanded the release of all documentation concerning the reconstruction of the Novi Sad railway station. Specifically, students wanted to know how much it cost overall, why the reconstruction costs had increased 5-fold, Now, I'm not entirely sure how they know it increased fivefold when they don't know how much it cost. This is from the protesters' website directly. They have an English page. And who was responsible for the fact that the railway station was ceremonially opened twice despite not having an occupancy permit? They wanted confirmation from relevant authorities of the identities of all people for whom there was a reasonable suspicion that they physically assaulted students and professors during this silent vigil and the initiation of criminal proceedings against them. And then the dismissal of those people if it was shown that they held public office. The withdrawal of all charges, this is number 3, the withdrawal of all criminal charges from students who are protesting at the vigil, and a 20% increase in funding to be allocated to state universities. That was the one that seems to have been added in a bit later because there's no additional context there. It's just, and we want more money, which I thought was quite funny.
Well, I've been getting more into learning about contract negotiations in a union setting. That one definitely feels like a one that could be struck down in negotiations. Like, okay, fine, you get the other 3, but you're not getting any money for the university. That has nothing to do with this. And they'll be like, fine, okay.
Well, it's funny because it seems like over the years, and there's quite a lot of conflicting information out there, or not easy to discern information out there, because at various times the Serbian government has promised to release these files, but doesn't appear to have actually done so.
And that last demand also gives me, I don't know if you've seen the episode of South Park, Canada on Strike.
I have not, no.
Maybe I'll do an episode on that as a fiction one, where I can break down what went wrong with Canada on strike. But basically the countries of the world go to Canada, they say, why are you striking? They're like, we want more money. And that's it.
Well, that actually was a general strike called as part of this protest in January. 24th of January, various online businesses went on strike for only 12 hours or so. It wasn't a hugely effective strike, but it was part of the protest movement. But as you say, these protests kind of became a flashpoint for dissatisfaction with the government as a whole. They've been going on for 9 months now, protests pretty much every day since November. And so to understand why, we need to look at the ruling party of Serbia, which is called the Progressive Party, the SNS, which is translated from Serbian, but SNS is the Serbian acronym, but English name is the Progressive Party. And the president of Serbia is called Aleksandar Vučić. Have you seen Vučić? You know this guy? He looks like a big nerd. He looks like the kind of guy you would like shove into a locker.
Oh, I have not. When I was picturing the president of Serbia, I was picturing a very different individual.
No, he looks super nerdy. He is quite a lanky guy, but if he wasn't an authoritarian, I would be nicer to him.
Gone are the days of the tracksuit mob rulers in Serbia. Now it's the nerds.
Indeed. He became involved in politics during the Yugoslavian Civil War. He was president of information under Slobodan Milosevic, and overhauled the media landscape, banning foreign media from Serbia for a while, and basically broadcasting a lot of propaganda.
Milosevic is not a guy you want as a reference on your resume, by the way, to our listeners unaware.
No, he's a convicted war criminal.
He's one of the only ones that the international justice system has worked, for, where he's the example of a ruling individual that has been sentenced to death, right? Or how did
was he sentenced to death?
I don't know. He was given the highest punishment possible by the court. I didn't know if they had death penalty or not.
He became the first sitting head of state to be charged with war crimes. He was arrested by Yugoslavian authorities in 2001 following a 36-hour armed standoff between police and his bodyguards at his Belgrade villa, and he was extradited to the International Criminal Court in The Hague under pressure from the United States, or else Yugoslavia would lose financial aid from the IMF and World Bank. The prosecution took 2 years to present its case, part of the trial. Throughout the 2-year period, this was being closely followed, but Milosevic died before the trial's conclusion. Following his death, he was posthumously found guilty of war crimes.
So the current president was basically a minister of propaganda for this guy.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed.
How did he end up ruling a party called the Progressive Party?
Honestly, it's just the name. He founded it in 2008, pro-European offshoot of the Radical Party, which was the party that was in the ruling coalition before then. And they ran on an anti-corruption campaign, ironically. They became the largest party in 2012. Vučić became prime minister in 2014 and has been president since 2017. And over the decade that the Progressive Party has been in power, the country has taken a more authoritarian slide. In fact, they're now listed as a sort of soft autocracy in the sense that they do have elections that have the veneer of democracy, but Vučić has high degrees of control over state institutions, including the police, the courts, and especially the media, which do rather tip the scales in his favor. The government has huge controlling stakes in national media, and during the last election cycle, the national broadcaster in Serbia spent 94% of their political coverage favorably covering the Progressive Party.
I can believe it. And I know that this government has strong ties to Putin and Russia. Does that mean it's specifically this party and this individual that are very close to Russia?
Yeah, it seems that they are trying to play both sides a little bit. Putin has been spoken out vocally in favor of Vučić in the face of these protests, whereas the EU has kind of been very quiet about it, and they've expressed support for the right to protest in a very sort of broad blanket way, but the EU is really trying not to tip their hand in a way that Russia is being very supportive of Vučić. And part of the reason for that is that one of the other causes for protests in Serbia is directly related to the EU. The Novi Sad protests emerged in 2024, but there were other mass protests that happened in the past 2 years. In summer 2023, there were 2 mass shootings in Serbia, which Vučić's critics blamed on the government control of the media landscape and a promotion of violence. And then in August 2024, protests emerged following a deal which Vučić had signed with the EU and Rio Tinto for 2.4 billion euros, which gave the EU and Rio Tinto access to lithium deposits in Serbia, and people were concerned over the environmental impact of that there. So these are some of the other issues around which people are protesting. As you said, the Novi Sad protests are really a representation of the wider issues that exist in Serbia. One of the other ones, which I thought was interesting, is protests around what's happening to the former army headquarters, the former Yugoslavian army headquarters, which was bombed by NATO in 1999. And this has become a site of protest because Vučić sold it to a development company owned by Jared Kushner, who wanted to turn it into luxury apartments.
What?
Yeah. So Jared Kushner's involved.
What's up with Kushner just wanting to develop like war-torn spots? He's like, I will make the Gaza Riviera. I will develop this former military base.
I suppose property is ultimately the Trump dynasty's bread and butter, right? Like that's where they made their fortune originally. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, the thing that all of these have in common is corruption. After the Novi Sad disaster, some people were arrested, but corruption charges were all absent from the arrest reports. And whilst the transport minister who was responsible for this was arrested, he was released almost immediately with no consequences, basically. And there's been a lot of scrutiny over how these contracts work. Part of the reason that Vučić has remained in power is that he has pointed out that he has overseen the growth of GDP in Serbia. He has overseen the growth in wages, which is true. Inflation has been high in this time, but wages and GDP have gone up. And he's also boasted ownership of these large infrastructure projects, which have been conducted largely in collaboration with the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative.
I was going to ask if this particular railway station was part of that.
Yes, it is. It's part of the Belt and Road Initiative, but shady dealings have gone on. Basically, the contracts, as far as we know, because the details haven't been released fully, but the contracts all went to Chinese construction firms who then subcontracted it out to Serbian construction firms.
That makes a lot more sense to me, because I'm like, that does not seem like some Chinese infrastructure work there collapsing like that.
No. Well, it's all corruption all the way down, basically, and the prices have gone up and up and up, lined lots of pockets, and resulted in very shoddy work that killed a bunch of people, as the protesters allege. So this is the context for the protests. There have been some inciting incidents, but really it's a protest against the sort of high level of corruption that exists within Serbia. Despite that, so 3 years ago, Vucic's approval rating was 60%, and now it's down to 30%, which is still fairly high. And for this reason, in part, students in the beginning part of the protest resisted calls for snap elections. Do you have an inkling for why this might be the case?
I mean, looking at the context, I can see that this guy, Vucic, wields immense power, especially over communication around the country. So I do think that if they weren't prepared to oppose him, if other people weren't prepared to oppose him in a meaningful way, and there was a snap election called, it does seem like he could spin this and win re-election fairly handily with the resources he possesses.
Yeah, that's basically it. There is no one that could fill the void of Vucic, or it's believed there is no one who could successfully run this campaign. There is an opposition party in Serbia, but they are also not trusted. They are seen as elitist and out of touch. I suppose similar to how the Democrats are seen in the United States.
Yeah.
However, this kind of changed about 6 months into the protests, and they were huge before this. On the 22nd of December, 100,000 people gathered in Belgrade, which at the time were the biggest protests since the fall of Milosevic. Government media got blamed after people driving a car ran down some protesters. In January, the protests got bigger. Professionals, medics, farmers joined the protesters, and farmers actually drove tractors into towns to protect protesters.
The farmer driving a tractor into the town is such a classic protest move, you know?
Super classic.
You see it in France, you see it in India. It's a classic move.
Yeah. They have their own grievances that they are sort of piggybacking onto the momentum of this protest with. A lot of that was around fuel prices and how fuel prices were going to go up. Serbia has the second highest diesel price in Europe after Denmark, and it was going to go up even more. Of course, Serbia is not as rich as Denmark, and so that could be a real problem for Serbian farmers. And also, they don't have a strong irrigation policy in Serbia, and there are water shortages in some areas of Serbia in regards to farming, and so the farmers want those to be implemented as well. But their primary goal is to protect these student protesters because that's where they see momentum as existing.
Knowing your role, right? Knowing your role in the protest.
Knowing your role,
and
exactly.
To draw back to some of our preseason episodes, you kind of see the hallmarks of successful protest movements in the past. You see a lot of motifs here going on that exist in a lot of other protests. You have the student leaders at the front, right? They're the ones that started all this, even though it's not an issue that directly was related to students necessarily, but they were the ones out there first, and then the rest of society kind of trickling in. The thing that sparked it at the start, where you said it was sort of these goons that beat up students and professors, I'm wondering if that's a trend that we'll notice in protest as well, because if you remember when I've spoken about Hong Kong, at the second large protest when people were leaving and going home at one of these very distant stations, MTR stations out in new territories, there were these men that were allegedly armed with batons and helmets by police that went and beat up protesters there, sort of allegedly on behalf of the government. There was police were nowhere to be found at the time, etc., etc. So I'm wondering if this is a tactic that over time, as we look in history or we look today, that we will see when the government gets frustrated and want to try an intimidation tactic early on, if that's a move they go to, sort of the violence that they can allow at the distance and have some deniability towards.
Well, I think that is something you see more and more, especially as states lose their ability to maintain power through more subtle ways. There was a great book that I read as part of my master's degree, Power and Its Disguises, and this pointed out, which is that repression and oppression is a sign of a weak state because powerful states employ more subtle methods of control. In March of 2025, 325,000 people were protesting in Belgrade. The prime minister resigned, but Vučić continues to hold on to power and holds counter rallies. So after 6 months of protests, basically every day, there have been little progress towards meeting the demands of the initial protests, and the students changed tack. They collaborated with lawyers, professors, farmers, various experts. In addition to worrying about the lack of opposition, Vučić in previous elections had been sort of accused of fixing things. It was worried that these elections would not be effective. So they changed tack and eventually saw the momentum and made 18 demands and called for snap elections. They demanded the freedom of the media, free and fair elections, an end to corruption, significant safety checks for all construction works, investment in science and research in the arts and culture and public health, strengthening workers' rights, and a strict candidate selection requirement for the new elections. They said, look, none of us students are going to stand. That's something that they were sort of giving as a concession. No students will stand, but no members of the ruling party will stand for elections, and no members of the parliamentary opposition will stand either, because they are also not trusted in Serbia. And these were all parts of the demand of the students once they shifted tack in order to give this student list program.
Let that be a lesson to opposition parties. Be ready and build goodwill, right? Yeah. Because this seemed like an opportune moment for them to take power, if not for the mistrust they have.
Exactly. So this was part of the new demands that emerged 6 months after the protests started. There were some local elections in May, which, whilst the Progressive Party did win, it was a very narrow victory. And in previous local elections, they won by a margin of 80%. So they dropped to just over 50%. And that was after funneling lots and lots of money into these local elections, lots of propaganda efforts. So based on polling and these local elections, Vučić is now no longer sure that they would win these elections. The next ones scheduled are in 2027. He has repeatedly rejected calls for snap elections coming before then. We will have to see whether those hold up. People say that he's not confident of the outcome of this election. He has stated that he will not stand in 2027, but I think people are perhaps rightly suspicious of this claim.
And for context, you said it was over 300,000 protesters regularly in Belgrade, the capital. And what's the population of Belgrade?
Of Belgrade, I'm not sure. Of Serbia, it's 6.5 million. Belgrade population, 1.1 million.
So you have essentially a third of the city, which is huge and disruptive. But I guess I have a question for you, and that is, it doesn't seem like this party is doing anything right. So this may be a wider question that applies to our own societies in different countries, the US, the UK, the rest of Europe. Why does this party still win over 50% in a local election, or why do they still have 30% in favor of Vučić? Like, where is this support coming from? Is it a lack of education? Is it a traditionalist mindset? Is it what do you think is the cause?
I think it's a whole bunch of factors. I think part of it is a lack of effective opposition. I think part of it is the fact that they have control over the media in this way, and they can make these claims, make these boasts, basically, about what are some big infrastructure projects, mired corruption, and the fact that they are capitalizing on anti-Western sentiment. Vučić has claimed that the protesters are paid agitators by the West, which is believed by some people, and they believe that it's part of a Western campaign to bring down Vučić's government. You know, there are people in Serbia, in Belgrade, who remember the NATO bombings. These were real things that were very destructive in Serbia. And indeed, one of the articles I was reading about this was on Radio Free Liberty, which is simply a propaganda arm for the United States, which operates throughout Europe. So, it's not to say that there isn't any Western interest in Vučić not maintaining corruption, but there also is interest in Vučić remaining in power, as evidenced by the EU making these lithium deals. And this is why a materialist perspective is so important. It allows you to see what's going on by looking at where interests lie.
100%. And that trope of, the protesters are paid actors, that's a very commonly used one over here in the US. I don't know about the UK or in the Netherlands, but a lot of people believe that. I would say almost every person that I've seen online or met that is still a Republican after all these years, they believe that any protests they see against Trump are paid by the Democrats.
Yeah, it's amazing that the Democrats have that kind of money.
Well, I always say, where's my check? Come on.
Yeah, right.
I've been doing this for free.
Yeah. If anyone wants to pay us to go to protests, hit us up.
Yeah, of course. So, yeah, we're open to that type of sponsorship. So my question is that a trope you've seen in your life as well? Or is the populace of Europe a bit more educated to believe that?
I haven't seen that so much in Europe. I don't know I don't know whether it simply doesn't exist or whether it's just not common as a rhetorical argument. I think that certainly when it comes to the UK, the anti-protest rhetoric that you see more is about like public nuisance more than anything else, and about quite a liberal take on it. Like, yes, of course, it's simply awful what's happening, but people have got to get to work. People have got to do this. You can't throw super artworks, etc. As Dr. King said, the most dangerous idea is the white moderate, and I think that's what plays out more in anti-protest measures, certainly in the UK, and I believe in the Netherlands as well, from what I've seen there. Other places, your results may vary.
If Nigel Farage, God forbid, ever gets any more power, I'm guessing he'll start using that rhetoric once the inevitable protests start against him. So he just kind of copies whatever Trump says, but in a more posh way, I guess.
Well, I mean, Keir Starmer's copying what the Republicans have said. He started talking about Britain's open borders immigration policy, which is a straight up US talking point.
Yeah.
Not true in either case, not even slightly, but it's part of their strategy to try and win votes from reform, which is not particularly effective.
Yeah, but we digress. We talk about these points a lot. But relating it back to Serbia, I guess these are the tools we're seeing at play within the country. And I guess when you look at this situation, you say, how can it not be overwhelmingly 90% of the population in support of these protesters? But I think, as you said, traditionalists, people that have bought into the propaganda, people that just kind of want status quo, that plays a huge factor in people's lives. But at the same time, I think when we look at this from a materialist perspective, you mentioned that protests had been ongoing before this happened in Serbia, and that to me indicates a worsening quality of life materially for people overall in the past few years. Because if life is good and a railway station's canopy collapses and people die, people will be upset, but it won't be a linchpin for destabilizing the whole government. It would just be that's sad anyway.
Yeah.
But the fact that so many people are so willing to be out there every day for months just shows that they're at their breaking point, right? Materially, they have been worse off than they have been before. And that's kind of saying something in Serbia, because the roaring 90s or whatever that were in Britain and the US was not going on in Serbia at all.
That's very true. And I think that also some people are attracted to power. I think that a lot of people, fascists in particular, believe that ultimately there's always going to be an oppressor and an oppressed, and that it is better to side with the oppressor for your own benefit. I don't think that's true, but I think that a lot of people do.
And have you been, because we hear about the rise of fascism more in the West, in that context, and I'd say Serbia is more East Europe, and has fascism been on the rise there as well?
I don't know about fascism per se. I'm not familiar enough with the environment there, but it has become more authoritarian over the past decade. That is absolutely true. corruption, at least according to the Corruption Perception Index, is at an all-time high in Serbia since the dissolution of Yugoslavia.
There's sort of a stereotype that I've been trying to avoid in this conversation, but that is that other people say this, that I don't say this, but that Slavic nations tend to lean authoritarian in times of strife, but also just generally that Slavic nations in the past have had more histories of authoritarian and corruption play out. I don't think that's necessarily true, but it is a stereotype prevalent in geopolitics.
I think that's largely a result of material circumstances, and that materially impoverished circumstances allow for the entrenchment of corruption and organized crime and links between government institutions and sort of self-enrichment are caused by material instability, which is imposed sometimes from within and sometimes through other geopolitical factors.
And that's a region of the world that we've seen a lot of destabilizing forces in the past century or so.
Absolutely.
Okay.
As Bismarck famously said at the turn of the 20th century, if ever Europe is again to be at war, it'll be over some damned foolish thing in the Balkans, which of course it was.
Of course.
The protests started to become a lot more violent about 10 days ago, as we're recording on the 24th of August, and no one seems to be entirely sure why. It is perhaps evidence that Vučić is increasingly lacks confidence in his ability to maintain power if there was an election. Goons linked to the Progressive Party were accused of throwing fireworks at protesters, and protesters were accused at throwing rocks and eggs back. Riot police started attacking protesters more violently as a result. There were some videos going around of riot police beating unarmed protesters with batons, flares, tear gas, crowd control vehicles. These have all been used on the protesters in Serbia over the past 10 days or so. Vučić has praised the police for being tough on the protesters and has promised that there are more arrests to follow. The story continues to develop. There doesn't seem to be... We do not appear to be any closer to a resolution at this point, but that's a little rundown as to what's been going on in Serbia over the past 9 months or so, and some context leading up to it.
Thank you for that. My question to you is, we're at a crossroads here, and there appear to be different possible outcomes for this. Mm-hmm. What are the different options you see going from here in Serbia in the future? What are the possible scenarios that could play out for better or for worse?
Well, I think that you're right. There are a few options. I think that one of them is that things continue for a little while. The repression gets more and more. Crackdown on protesters increases to escalate. That the sort of spine of the protests is broken and people go back to an uneasy acquiescence to Vučić's rule. I think that the other option is that both sides kind of run out of steam a little bit and you go back to more sort of moderate protests and he limps on to the elections in 18 months' time. I think there is an outside chance of the protests being successful and Vučić caving to the pressure, or indeed reacting more strongly to the increased repression at the protests and Vučić being sort of forced to set down. In fact, just a few days ago, in fact, a week ago, the offices of the ruling party were set on fire as part of the protests going on. So it is entirely possible that this continues to heat up, as it were, if you'll excuse the pun. Mm. In other scenarios, you might see outside powers becoming more interested. The EU could take a stance on it, and the EU's envoy to Serbia is encouraging that. Though, again, this is potentially unlikely because of EU interests in materials in Serbia. The US has stressed that they support the right to protest, but not the right to occupy or destroy government buildings, and Russia has backed Vučić. So the international community seems pretty muted about what's going on in Serbia at the time, though if violence continues to escalate, we'll see whether that continues.
As you mentioned before, material interest really plays out here, because in an ideological sense, it's very clear where the EU should stand on this, right? Mm. But as you mentioned, the moneyed interests that will only benefit a few people are keeping them out of the fight.
Yeah, to sum up your question about possible outcomes from this, I think that there is a scenario in which early elections happen. There is a scenario in which the protests sort of peter out. There is a scenario in which the protests are crushed and lots of people are arrested. And there is a unlikely scenario in which Vučić is toppled.
Well, is there a scenario in which he suspends the elections and solidifies his sort of dictatorship?
Sure, but that's 18 months away.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot that can happen in that time. Not until 2027 that's supposed to happen.
Because I think as protesters, it's very important to have possible outcomes in mind. Everyone wants to be extremely optimistic. And I think that radical optimism is very important in protest. But especially for the leaders, I think it's important to understand what other outcomes could happen and to be prepared for other ones as well, especially ones that are still in your favor, maybe not your optimum result, but one that is good overall. I've seen protests, get crushed when there was no alternative scenarios that were being discussed. It was just, we want everything or nothing, and the government say, okay, cool, nothing then.
Right. Yeah, and that may still be what we get from that.
I appreciate your insight on this, because this was a situation that I found fairly confusing when it would come up in the news, just because cause and effect doesn't seem to apparently be there if you don't know the context, right? Oh, this train station collapsed, therefore 300,000 people are in the street in Belgrade every night for 9 months. That doesn't compute. Yeah. So it's good to know the context. It's good to know that this is just a wider scenario that's played out over the past few years with corruption in Serbia.
Yeah, people have been pushed to a breaking point, and they've had enough. And we'll see whether the state can contain that, or whether the state breaks in response.
We also will certainly have an update at the end of the year when we wrap up protests that have occurred over this year. I think we will highlight this one in particular to see if anything changed, to see if it's the same.
Absolutely, and I look forward to finding out what goes on in Serbia. Look forward to an interesting one, because it might be bad.
We're radically optimistic as well, right?
We are indeed. And to sum up that optimism, I have a quote for you at the end here. But thank you so much for discussing this with me, Sam. Thank you to you, dear listener, for listening. Look after each other and keep fighting the good fight. To take us away, Sam, could you read us this quote from William Faulkner?
Never be afraid to raise your voice for honesty and truth and compassion against injustice and lying and greed. If people all over the world would do this, it would change the earth.